And we are thrilled to welcome on Cowboys insider RJ Ochoa for, I believe, the third time now. Covers all things for Dallas Cowboys, SBNation's Blogging the Boys. Hosts the Ocho and Saturday Morning Hangover on ESPN San Antonio at ESPN underscore SA. RJ, how's it going, man?
It's going well, man. It's busy times. Summer's here, so it's getting kind of hot in San Antonio. But other than that, everything is going well.
Absolutely, dude, and it's starting to get hot in the football world. And what we wanted to have you back on at some point, anyways, just because you've been a fantastic interview these last two times. But what really piqued our interest is you just recently released a piece on Kellen Moore. And I'm very intrigued to learn as much as I can. They have so many intriguing fantasy options here on the Cowboys. You got my number one overall pick, one of my favorite value QBs, a potential number one wide receiver. So let's talk about the guy that could potentially glue this all together and put it all into motion, Kellen Moore. What can we expect? I loved what you detailed about Dan Orlovsky's comments. Can you kind of summarize and give our listeners some key points to what you think Kellen Moore is going to be rolling out here in Dallas?
Sure. So Dan Orlovsky, the former Detroit Lions quarterback, now ESPN analyst, was on, I believe it was the Mina Kimes podcast. And he talked about, obviously shared a season with Kellen Moore up in the Motor City. And, talked about how Kellen is a really sort of innovative offensive mind. I think a lot of college football fans remember Kellen Moore and what he did at Boise State. He's the all-time winningest quarterback in college football history. Obviously, he played all of his eligible seasons there. That does affect that stat sometimes in people's eyes. But Kellen is a guy who believes in movement, who believes in spreading the ball, and who understands, seemingly unlike his predecessor and in some ways mentor, Scott Linehan, that Dak Prescott has the ability to get out of the pocket and the ability to move and the ability to run. There was a lot of chatter and a lot of discussion that the Cowboys' Week 17 game in New York last season, their big win against the New York Giants, it was a meaningless game for the Cowboys as they'd already locked up everything they could for the playoffs. But they played their starters, and Dak Prescott had a career day from a statistical perspective, and there was some chatter that Kellen Moore had a heavier hand in that offensive game plan, as did Jason Garrett. Doug Nussmeier, the Cowboys tight ends coach, who was Amari Cooper's offensive coordinator at the University of Alabama. And so if if you're looking for a piece of data, that's really the one. Week 17 against the Giants, Dak had over 400 yards. He had the great game winner to Cole Beasley. And so he's a guy who I think is finally going to be the one that, lets Dak Prescott run a little, which is exciting.
Absolutely. I mean, there's tons of stats about how successful Dak's been running in the red zone, running just in general, but especially in the red zone. So if this guy's going to, I think I'm looking at it right now. I believe it's 4.46 yards per carry in the red zone, which the league averages 2.64. He's scored 18 touchdowns in the red zone between 2016 and 2018. And that's not with a ton of designed runs either, like what you're saying with Kellen Moore. So tons of upside for Dak, who's going as the quarterback 21. He's finished as a top 10 guy in all three of his seasons. One of my favorite values. In terms of the passing game and some options that he might have, obviously Amari Cooper. Once he got there, everything really started to take off for Dak, for Cooper himself. But he's been so boom or bust when he was with the Raiders. Is there a chance he finds some consistency here after being the seventh highest scoring fantasy wide receiver from week 9 on once he joined him? He was on pace for 1,300 yards, 11 scores. Is that something you think he can maintain for a full season? What are you expecting with him and Kellen Moore's offense with Cooper?
Well, I think what Amari did over the second half of last season was very special, and I think that's hard to replicate. I mean, it was a really special run. Obviously, turned the Cowboys season around, and there were some big days he had. He had a big Thanksgiving Day game against the Washington Redskins. He had the huge game against the Philadelphia Eagles. He even caught the game winner off the tip pass in overtime. And so from a statistical perspective, from a fantasy perspective, I don't know that, Amari can or will, I should say, reach the pace that you noted he would have had he played 16 games for the Cowboys last season. But I do think he's certainly a serviceable wide receiver. I mean, he's obviously the focal point of the offense, and the fact that Doug Nussmeier, who's an Alabama offensive coordinator, is on the staff is a very helpful thing. And I think, there's a common sense factor of this is the guy that saved us. This is the piece of our offense that really moves things. And so I think Amari Cooper is going to be a huge factor. Obviously, Des Bryant was a really prolific fantasy receiver for a long time for the Cowboys. I think a lot of that is he was pretty touchdown dependent. Des is the franchise's all-time leader in receiving touchdowns. But Amari does seem like a guy that, I think you can count on for solid, depending on how your scoring is, 13-ish points a game, whether that's 70, 80 yards and a touchdown. Maybe he picks up 110 yards and no score. He's kind of living in that range, and he's a pretty reliable guy. I think that's what we're going to see from Kellen Moore.
Absolutely would love to see that, because that's been the one downside with Cooper. He has those huge games and then you get nothing and he kills you. So if Kellen Moore and Cooper can just keep that consistency going, it'd go a long way for a guy that's going around 3 or so right now, could really anchor a fantasy passing attack. In terms of other passing game options, we know they brought in Randall Cobb maybe to replace Cole Beasley in the slot there. What do you expect out of him? Is Michael Gallup, who's behind Cooper, if anyone, could carve out some meaningful fantasy value here?
Well, the guy I think would probably be Michael Gallup. Terrence Williams was serviceable, I think, for a stretch from a fantasy perspective, and Michael Gallup certainly fills that role, although the offense is different. I mean, Terrence Williams' career with the Cowboys kind of overlapped with Scott Linehan's time running the offense. And so I think Michael Gallup is a guy. We saw him have success both before and after Amari Cooper arrived with the Cowboys. In fact, a lot of people believe Michael Gallup's best game was the Cowboys' playoff loss to the Rams. I think he's a guy. I mean, I think, if you're like me on your team, you like to have 5 or 6 receivers. I think he's a great sort of 5th or 6th guy to rely on. I don't know that, I would draft Randall Cobb. I don't know, because that is such a wild card. The Cowboys have used him out of the backfield up to this point, and so we'll see if that's something that really is part of their offensive game plan. But ultimately, it's hard to justify using Randall Cobb in the backfield when you have a guy like Zeke Elliott, because that's one less snap for him and one less opportunity for you to do something special.
And perfect segue right there, because I wanted to get into Zeke Elliott. He's my personal number 1 overall pick in fantasy. He's been nothing but dominant whenever he's on the field. Led the league in rushing 2 out of his 3 seasons, the only 2 full seasons he's had. The floor is as firm as can be, and last year they seemed to really start tapping into those underrated receiving skills. I loved him as a pass blocker always, and they finally started getting him the ball in the passing game, 77 receptions. So I think they discredit Zeke's ceiling as well. Do you think it could be even higher than we realize with the OC change, or what are you expecting from Zeke now in his 4th season here?
So this is Zeke's 4th season. I think I certainly won't knock you for having him as your number 1 overall player. He is safe. And I think when you look at from a fantasy perspective, it's hard to know what Le'Veon Bell is going to be. It's hard to know what Todd Gurley is going to be. So you're right. I think he has the safest floor among sort of fantasy premier running backs. But I do think this will be a different season for Zeke Elliott. The Cowboys, they do have Randall Cobb, who is an option out of the backfield. They drafted Tony Pollard out of Memphis, who's a special sort of also gadget dynamic player that they plan on utilizing. Gil Brandt, who has really tapped into the Cowboys, published his rookie projections, I believe, on Wednesday this week. And he had Tony Pollard going for 500 yards. And that is, while I feel ambitious, somewhat of an indication at how much Tony Pollard could be utilized. And I think that Tony Pollard can certainly help the Cowboys have a lot of success in terms of wins and in terms of winning the NFC East and, competing for a Super Bowl. But if he does have 500 yards, that's 500 less yards for Zeke. And in many ways, that's a good thing for the Cowboys. Zeke has been the pinnacle of health for the Cowboys, certainly in his time. You mentioned he obviously missed time 2 years ago thanks to the 6-game suspension. But I mean, he is somebody who you want to monitor, and he is somebody who you want to keep fresh down the stretch, and he is somebody who, if you can get somebody there to supplement his big carries, I think it's a good idea from an overall football perspective. My only caution would be the Tony Pollard factor, but I would still roll the dice on that versus a Todd Gurley or Le'Veon Bell, given those question marks.
Yeah, would you take him, do you think, over, let's say, the other guys often weighed up there are Alvin Kamara, Christian McCaffrey, especially in your PPR format. Those are and obviously Saquon Barkley, too, in the division as well. Do you think Zeke, he's still personally for me, I have him up there, but would you, as a Cowboys fan, take him up there, too?
I think I would, but I don't think you can go wrong with any of those guys. Obviously, Alvin Kamara is great. Christian McCaffrey, I think everybody's always scared that he's going to get hurt. There was that picture that floated around social media this offseason. I think he's great. And again, PPR formats, he's fantastic. I personally am always spooked by Saquon, just given the Eli factor, and just you never know how that's going to work out. Although my cousin took him ahead of me last year, right before I picked, and I ended up with Leonard Fournette, and I felt like a winner And so, I have kind of turned on Saquon just thanks to that experience.
That is a brutal just contrast there. Saquon Barkley just anchoring team championships and Fournette ruining seasons. Apologize for hearing that one already. But other than that, I'm trying to think of any other real relevant parties. We got Jason Witten coming out of retirement. And Blake Jarwin, a guy you kind of told us about last year too, seemed like he was finally kind of becoming a heavy part of this offense by the end. And then Witten comes back. Is there anything that we could rely on as fantasy owners from the tight end position? What do you kind of see happening there?
Well, Blake Jarwin, I think, has a lot of talent. The Cowboys certainly believe in him. The game, we mentioned in New York in Week 17, he had those 3 touchdowns, and I think a lot of people, maybe daily fantasy had him that day, and it kind of worked out for them. But I don't think Blake Jarwin's draftable, given the presence of Jason Witten on the team this year. And I think Jason Witten, the position in general from a fantasy perspective is so difficult. Yeah. I think Jason Witten's a guy who, in standard formats, you can count on 4 points a game. There's all this talk, I guess, the relevant information. There's all this talk about he's come back and he's not going to be this guy that takes all these snaps. He's just here to kind of be part of the ride, be a leader, etc. I know he was not necessarily that great at it, but I just don't think Jason Witten gave up the #1 job in many people's eyes in terms of being a color football analyst to come play 12 snaps a game. I imagine Jason Witten to be part of the process, and I think he's going to kind of have his sort of normal role, his 40-ish yards a game. And, he's a safer floor than most, but I think there are definitely way more appealing options out there.
Absolutely. And I do just want to return to Dak real quick because, again, I think he's maybe the best value quarterback in fantasy right now, falling well beyond rounds 12, 20-something quarterbacks getting picked before him. And you mentioned one way he could improve under Kellen Moore is the rushing being used more in that sense. Is there any other reasons Kellen Moore could continue to unlock Dak Prescott's upside, or just any reason we should expect a strong performance from Dak here in this season?
I think that Dak's going to be a better passer, and I hate to be that broad about it, but that was something Dan Orlovsky talked about is, Kellen is working with Dak in terms of changing up his launch point. Getting him out of the pocket to throw, getting him on the move, even if it's not running, but just on the move and out of the pocket to find different guys. He's got some receivers that can do some special things and get open. So I do think that we will see Dak Prescott have more success through the air. We've seen him have those types of plays, those really successful ones. And you mentioned it. If you're thinking about a fantasy quarterback, he's got 18 rushing touchdowns. He's had 6 in each of his last 3 seasons. It's only 3 seasons. And those aren't, your, standard goal line on the 1 yard line jump and just push it over the goal line. Those are running it in, as you mentioned, 4.6 yards per carry in the red zone. Those are legitimate, sort of QB keeper plays or broken plays that he turns into something special. I think overall, Dak's going to be a far more reliable option in 2019.
Absolutely. I'm going to keep drafting that guy, and then this is only making me more confident than him. So a couple of predictions out of you here. The Cowboys last year were in the bottom half of the league in scoring, right around, I think, 11 with 339 points. Do you see how big of a leap do you think they could make under Kellen Moore?
I think they're good for, 17 to 20 points a game right now. That's kind of where I feel. And that's kind of where they were last season, and that's really not a lot in 2019. I get that. But, as much hype and as much optimism as there is in Kellen Moore, the reality is we're talking about a guy that, 2 years ago was behind Dak Prescott on the Cowboys depth chart that got beat out by Cooper Rush, who's now fighting for the Cowboys backup quarterback job himself. And so, there is a lot of reason to convince yourself that Kellen is going to be this great guy, but he's still really young. He's still a kid. This is only his second year serving as a coach in general. And so, while there is the one possibility that he's going to come in and just be this bright mind that changes the way offenses work in the NFL, there is also the possibility that he's going to be terrible. Yeah. He did learn at the foot of Scott Linehan, who he is replacing. And so overall, I think the Cowboys, people are always hesitant to trust them from a fantasy perspective, or at least have been over the last year. They're a team that wants to play defense and wants to run the ball and end the game that way. They're not a team that's in the business, or they haven't been recently, beating you 40-36, and so if you're looking for points, I mean, you're safer, honestly, looking for a team or mining from a team like New Orleans, like Kansas City, like the Rams, because those are guys you can trust their offenses to throw the ball more, and until we see it, it's hard to trust with the Cowboys.
Gotcha. And then just in a general season perspective, where do you see the Cowboys finishing in terms of a record, in terms of the division, and by the end of it all, what's the Cowboys' situation in 2019?
I think they'll compete for the NFC East. I think that people are maybe a little too optimistic. I think in a weird way, people are too optimistic, and the Cowboys are slept on in so many ways. Mm-hmm. They did win 10 games last season, but they beat Atlanta on a last-second field goal. They beat Detroit on a last-second field goal. There was that tip ball that Amari Cooper caught against the Eagles that ended up being a win. So there's 3 wins that if an act of God, a strong win happens, you're talking they go the other way. And so you go from a 10-6 team to a 7-9 team. And so you're kind of jump roping that fine line. I do think that this is a team that, is capable of 9-11 wins, just depending on the breaks of the game. The breaks of the game happen a lot of times, and over the second half of the season, the Cowboys caught a lot of those breaks. And so ultimately, I do think they'll be in the thick of things when it comes to the NFC East. They do benefit from the fact that the Giants are such a mess, that the Redskins kind of don't know what they're doing at the moment. They are, at the very least, maybe potentially getting things going in the right direction. And I think the Eagles are such a big question mark. We have no idea what Carson Wentz is going to be like. Can he stay healthy the entire season? So I think a division title is a fair floor, but ultimately, can they make it to the NFC Championship game? I mean, they did grind that win out against the Seahawks. They deserve all the credit in the world for that, but they did lose to the Rams. Can they get back there? Can they beat the Rams? Can they beat the Saints in the Superdome? Things like that. It's really a questionable situation. Teams tend to evolve over the course of the season. Maybe the Cowboys will be that kind of squad, but right now I think 9-11 wins, a playoff win, and then after that we'll have to cross our fingers.
Awesome. Well, RJ, thanks so much for coming on and joining us. You want to just give our listeners one last reminder where they can find you, where they can connect?
Yeah, I mean, I'm on Twitter at RJ Ochoa. You can find all our Cowboys stuff at bloggingtheboys.com. I do a lot of stuff with ESPN San Antonio as well, and then right here, hanging out with you guys.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, my man. Maybe we'll catch up a little bit later in the summer as we see how this offense is evolving in camp and whatnot. Really appreciate the time, though.
Sounds good, man. Anytime.
All right.